April 18, 1942. 8:30 minutes in the morning. Shangrao Air Base, Jiangxi Province, occupied China. Colonel Takeda Masahiro, 43 years old, a veteran of 15 years of service in the Imperial Japanese Army and commander of the occupation forces in the region, received the intelligence report with hands that shook not with fear, but with suppressed fury. 16 American B-25 Mitchell bombers had just attacked Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe in a coordinated attack that had humiliated the empire before the entire world. The planes, commanded by 45-year-old Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, had taken off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on a mission deemed impossible by the U.S. Navy itself, flown 400 miles over hostile waters, bombed the heart of Japan, and then proceeded to land in Chinese territory controlled by nationalist forces. The report said that most of the crews had survived, ejecting over Zhejiang province or making forced landings in Chinese fields. Takeda crumpled the paper between his fingers as his jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth grind. He had spent 3 years building an efficient occupation machine in that region of China, keeping villages under control through a balanced system of force and forced cooperation. Now, 80 American men were hidden somewhere in that vast expanse of mountains, rice fields, and countless villages, protected by Chinese peasants whom the Japanese army had tried to subdue. For Takeda and the high command in Tokyo, this was not just a military issue. It was a matter of tarnished imperial honor that demanded immediate and violent restoration. He summoned his senior officers to an emergency meeting that would begin in 30 minutes. What none of them knew as they planned their response to the American attack was that the decisions made in that room over the next few days would result in the deaths of 250,000 Chinese civilians in a retaliatory campaign that would become one of the least known but most brutal atrocities of World War II. 3 months earlier, in January 1942, Washington, D.C., 60-year-old President Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced a crisis of domestic morale that threatened the American war effort before it could even gain real momentum. Pearl Harbor had occurred just 7 weeks earlier, killing 2,403 Americans and sinking or severely damaging 18 warships. The Philippines was falling. Guam had been captured. Wake Island was surrounded. Japan seemed invincible, advancing across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed that shocked Western military analysts. The American public, still processing the trauma of Pearl Harbor, desperately needed some evidence that the United States could fight back, that the American industrial giant was not defenseless in the face of the Japanese war machine. Roosevelt called together his chiefs of staff and asked a direct question: how long until we can bomb Tokyo? The room fell into an awkward silence. 63-year-old Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, finally responded with the brutal honesty that characterized his leadership. Mr. President, with our current capabilities, bombing Tokyo would require aircraft carriers to come within 300 miles of the Japanese coast. That would put them within range of Japanese land fighters and make the mission suicidal. We have no land bases within 2,000 miles of Japan. Honestly, sir, it could take 2 years or more. Roosevelt slammed his hand on the table, not in anger, but with determination. Gentlemen, I don't have 2 years. The American people don't have 2 years. Find a way. It was Captain Francis Stewart Lowe, a 41-year-old submarine operations officer, who came up with the idea while observing aviation training camps near Norfolk, Virginia. He saw the landing strip and thought, an aircraft carrier has a landing strip. Medium bomber planes could take off from short runways. Technically, if you modified planes and had exceptionally skilled pilots, you could fly twin-engine bombers off an aircraft carrier. It would be dangerous, unconventional, and would violate all established naval doctrine, but it would be possible. The idea reached Admiral King, who immediately took it to one man: Doolittle. James Harold Doolittle was no ordinary pilot. He was possibly the most skilled aviator the United States possessed. At the age of 45, he had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had established set world airspeed records, won national and international air races, and developed instrument flying techniques that revolutionized aviation. He was technically retired from active service, working as vice president of the Shell Oil Company, when Pearl Harbor happened. He immediately volunteered to return to active duty, accepting a pay reduction of approximately 80%. When Admiral King and 55-year-old General Henry Harley Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, presented him with the plan to bomb Tokyo using B-25, Mitchell medium bombers taking off from an aircraft carrier, Doolittle studied the numbers for 48 hours and then said simply, "It's possible, but we'll need the best pilots you have, and even then some may not make it." He took command of the mission personally, insisting on flying the lead plane despite its age and value to strategic planning. For 8 weeks, Doolittle and 80 volunteer crew trained in absolute secrecy at Eglin Field, Florida. They practiced short takeoffs repeatedly, reducing the required distance from 600 meters to just over 150 meters. The planes were modified. Extra fuel tanks were installed. Ventral machine gun turrets were removed to save weight. Top-secret Norden targeting systems were adapted. Each man knew that the mission was essentially one way. The B-25 bombers did not have the range to return to the carrier after bombing Japan. The plan was to take off from the Hornet approximately 720 kilometers off the Japanese coast, bomb industrial and military targets in Tokyo and other cities, and then fly another 1,600 kilometers to Chinese nationalist-controlled airfields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, where they could refuel before flying to bases in British-controlled India. April 18, 1942, 6 hours and 24 minutes in the morning, 900 kilometers east of the Japanese coast, the USS Hornet and her escort ships faced rough seas and cloudy skies. The launch distance had been planned for 720 kilometers, but at 5 minutes past 6 in the morning, the cruiser USS Nashville sighted a Japanese fishing boat, the Nido Maru, which was clearly serving as an early warning patrol vessel. The Nashville sank the fishing boat with cannon fire, but not before she radioed a warning to Japanese command. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr., 59 years old, commander of the task force, made the decision to launch the planes immediately, even though they were still 900 kilometers from the target, 180 kilometers further than planned. This meant the bombers would have even less fuel to reach China, but waiting was ensuring that Japanese fighters would intercept the task force. At 7:25 in the morning, with the carrier rising and falling violently in 7-foot waves, Doolittle lined up his B-25 bomber on the Hornet's 200-foot runway. He had calculated that he needed 167 meters to take off safely, leaving a margin of error of only 73 meters. The takeoff control officer gave the signal, Doolittle pushed the throttles all the way forward, and the bomber loaded with 1,136 kilograms of bombs, 1,281 extra liters of gasoline, and a 5-man crew began rolling down the swaying runway. In the last 50 feet of the runway, when it looked like the bomber would fall into the ocean, Doolittle pulled back on the stick, and the B-25 climbed, slowly gaining altitude. Over the next 90 minutes, all 16 bombers took off successfully, a feat of piloting that impressed even the skeptical Navy officials who had declared the mission technically impossible. The planes flew in scattered groups at low altitude, staying within range of Japanese radar. At noon local Tokyo time, the first American bombers appeared over the Japanese capital on a sunny Saturday, as millions of civilians were on the streets. The shock was complete and utter. From the beginning of the war, the Japanese command had assured the population that the main islands were invulnerable to air attacks, that Japanese naval and air superiority made it impossible for enemy planes to reach the sacred territory of the empire. Now, twin-engine bombers with white stars painted on their wings flew 1,500 meters high in broad daylight over the imperial palace. Doolittle dropped his bombs on steel factories and military installations in Tohir. Other planes bombed Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Material damage was relatively limited, approximately 50 buildings destroyed or damaged, approximately 50 Japanese civilians killed. But the psychological damage was devastating. The myth of Japanese invulnerability had been destroyed. Emperor Hirohito, 41 years old, had to be evacuated from the palace to an underground bunker. Japanese civilians who had celebrated Pearl Harbor and the Pacific conquests now ran in panic as air raid sirens sounded for the first time over their cities. For the Japanese military command, the humiliation was unbearable. Not only had American planes bombed Japan, but no one knew where they had come from. The planes disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. Theories proliferated. Aircraft carriers had come impossibly close to the coast. Secret bases existed on Pacific islands. Perhaps the Soviets had allowed Americans to use bases in Siberia. The truth, that medium bombers had taken off from an aircraft carrier, was so unprecedented that Japanese analysts did not even seriously consider the possibility until days later. The 16 bombers, after completing their attacks, turned west towards China. The early launch, caused by the encounter with the patrol boat, meant that each plane had approximately 150 kilometers less fuel than planned. While flying over the East China Sea, pilots constantly calculated, adjusting altitude and speed to maximize fuel efficiency. Darkness fell over the Chinese coast at 8 o'clock in the evening, and weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. Low clouds and torrential rain made it impossible to find Chinese airfields that should have been lit with flares guiding planes to safe landing. Communication with nationalist Chinese forces had failed. The airfields were completely dark, either due to communication failure or fear of Japanese air attacks. One by one, the pilots realized that they would not reach the airfields. 15 air crews ordered abandonment, the men parachuting into the darkness over unknown territory, unseen mountains, and possibly Japanese forces. Captain Edward Joseph York, 26 years old, piloting plane number 13, realized that he did not have enough fuel to even reach the Chinese coast. He turned north and made an emergency landing in the Soviet Union near Vladivostok, where he and his crew were interned for 13 months. The Soviets were technically at peace with Japan and could not allow American fighters to operate from Soviet territory. A single bomber, piloted by Captain Edward York, managed to make a controlled landing near Kuzhou. The other 80 men of the remaining 15 crews landed by parachute dispersed across hundreds of kilometers of Chinese territory, most of them injured, all disoriented, none speaking Chinese, and completely dependent on local aid to survive. And help came. In poor villages across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, Chinese peasants who had lived under brutal Japanese occupation for 5 years risked their lives to save American airmen. Technical Sergeant David John Thatcher, 20 years old, radio operator in Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's plane, landed by parachute in a flooded rice field near the village of Yihuang at 3:15 in the morning. Wet, cold, and uncertain whether he was in nationalist or Japanese-controlled territory, he began walking. At dawn, he found a small farmhouse. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, came out and, despite clearly being terrified and unable to communicate verbally, gestured for him to come in and hid. She fed him rice and hot tea, bandaged a cut on his forehead, and then sent her teenage grandson to fetch men from the village. 4 hours later, a group of men arrived, including one who spoke a few words of English. Through gestural communication and drawings on the ground, Thatcher understood that Japanese forces were actively searching for American airmen and that he needed to move immediately. The villagers hid him in a cart under hay and transported him 18 kilometers to a Chinese nationalist outpost. This pattern was repeated dozens of times across the region. Chinese peasants, many extremely poor, shared their meager food with American airmen, walked with them over mountains at night to avoid Japanese patrols, used their own boats to transport them across rivers. First Lieutenant Thomas Robert White, 24 years old, bombardier navigator, seriously fractured his leg on landing or parachute. Chinese villagers carried him on a makeshift stretcher 96 kilometers through mountainous terrain to a missionary hospital in the city of Linhai, a 4-day journey. Without this help, White would certainly have died of infection or been captured by the Japanese. But in Tokyo and in Japanese military commands across occupied China, the reaction to Doolittle's attack was turning from humiliation to genocidal fury. On April 19th, the day after the attack, General Shunroku Hata, 62 years old, commander of the Chinese Expeditionary Army, with over 750,000 soldiers under his command, received direct orders from the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo. Locate and execute all captured American airmen, destroy all airfields in the coastal region of China, that could potentially be used for future air raids, and severely punish any Chinese civilian population who had helped the Americans. The word punish in Japanese military orders had a specific and terrible meaning that had been demonstrated repeatedly since the Nanking Massacre in 1937. Colonel Takeda, commanding forces in Jiangxi province, received his orders on April 20th, and immediately began what the Japanese would call Operation Seigo, the Zhejiang-Jiangxi punitive campaign. He called together his battalion commanders and delivered instructions with brutal clarity. Every village that helped Americans will be burned to the ground. Every man of military age will be executed. Every airfield in the region will be rendered permanently unusable. Agricultural resources will be destroyed to deny supplies to nationalist guerrillas. The Chinese population will learn the cost of aiding our enemies. What followed was one of the most systematic terror campaigns of the war. On April 23rd, 5 days after Doolittle's raid, units of the Japanese 13th Infantry Division arrived at the village of Ihuang, where peasants had helped several American airmen, including Sergeant Thatcher. The unit commander, Major Ichiro Sato, 38 years old, ordered all residents to gather in the village's central square. Approximately 240 people, mainly women, children, and elderly men, young men either serving in nationalist forces or having fled in anticipation of retaliation, were forced to kneel in rows. Through an interpreter, Sato demanded that the villagers identify who had helped the Americans. Nobody spoke. The elderly woman who had fed Thatcher, a woman named Chen Guiying, aged 72, remained silent, even as Japanese soldiers shouted threats inches from her face. Sato ordered 10 men to be selected at random. They were forced to dig their own graves while their families watched, so they were executed by bayonets, not gunfire, as bullets were considered too valuable to waste on Chinese civilians. When the executions were over, Sato gave the remaining villagers an hour to gather whatever they could carry. Then the entire village was burned. 163 buildings, granaries containing the rice harvest that would sustain the community for a year. Wells were poisoned with animal corpses. Ihuang ceased to exist. The survivors, now refugees, scattered to neighboring towns, carrying with them the terror of Japanese retaliation and the implicit message, helping Americans would cost not just lives, but entire communities. The campaign expanded exponentially. Japanese units totaling approximately 75,000 soldiers committed specifically to Operation Seigo swept through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces as a systematic destructive force. In Yushan, a city of approximately 12,000 inhabitants, where the airfield had been one of the planned destinations for Doolittle's bombers, Japanese forces arrived on April 28th. The airfield was completely destroyed. Runways were excavated with explosives to depths of 3 meters. Hangars were burned, equipment was destroyed or removed. But the destruction didn't stop at the military installation. Japanese soldiers entered the city and systematically burned every building within a 3-mile radius of the airfield. Approximately 450 structures were set on fire. Men found on the streets were presumed to be airfield workers or supporters of nationalists and summarily executed. Survivor testimonies, collected decades later by historians, described Japanese soldiers using flamethrowers on wooden houses, machine guns firing at civilians trying to flee, bayonets used against anyone who could not run. In a single day, approximately 1,800 civilians were killed in Yushan. The city was effectively erased from the map. The pattern repeated itself across the region with horrific variations. In Nancheng, an important transportation hub, Japanese forces carried out a scorched earth strategy that destroyed not only military installations, but all agricultural infrastructure within a 20-mile radius. Barns were burned, cattle were slaughtered and left to rot. Rice fields were flooded with salt water to make the soil infertile. The intention was not just to punish, but to create a starvation zone that would make it impossible for Chinese nationalist forces to operate in the region. Thousands of peasants, seeing their crops destroyed weeks before planting time, faced impossible choices: stay and starve, or try to migrate to regions already overpopulated by refugees. General Hata reported to the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo on May 10th that the operation was proceeding satisfactorily and that approximately 20,000 Chinese irregular fighters and their civilian supporters had been neutralized. Bureaucratic language masked genocide. Further analysis of Japanese records, cross-referenced with survivor testimonies and Chinese population records, suggests that the actual number of civilians killed up to that point already exceeded 50,000 people. Meanwhile, 8 of the 80 members of Doolittle's crews had been captured by Japanese forces. Lieutenant William Gardner Farrow, 23 years old, Lieutenant Robert John Metter, 24 years old, Lieutenant Dean Edward Hallmark, 23 years old, their navigators and gunners, including Sergeant Harold Arthur Spatz, 21 years old, and others, were transported to Tokyo and subjected to brutal interrogations. They were formally charged with war crimes for allegedly striking civilian targets, an ironic charge considering the mass massacre Japan was perpetrating in China in direct response to the mission. In August 1942, after military trials that lasted minutes and in which the accused had no legal representation, the 8 were sentenced to death. After intervention by Japanese officials who argued that executing them all would generate negative international publicity, 5 of the sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. 3 men, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 14, 1942. Their last words, recorded by Japanese guards, were messages to their families. Spatz, the youngest at 21, said simply, "Tell my mother I thought about her until the end." The 5 survivors remained in Japanese prisons under inhumane conditions. Lieutenant Mader died of malnutrition and dysentery in December 1943, weighing just 80 pounds when he passed away. The remaining 4 survived until the end of the war, but with permanent damage to their health. In China, Operation Seigo continued through May, June, and July of 1942 with increasing intensity. The campaign has expanded beyond retaliation for aid to American airmen to become a broader counterterrorism and population control operation. Any village suspected of harboring nationalist guerrillas, storing supplies, or simply being in a strategic area was targeted. Official Japanese policy, documented in military orders discovered after the war, was Sanko Sakusen, the 3-all, kill all, burn all, loot all. In June, units of the Japanese 11th Infantry Division conducted clearing operations through mountain valleys in Zhejiang province, where it was believed American airmen might be hiding. Villages were systematically burned, one after another, approximately 350 small communities destroyed in a period of 6 weeks. Residents who failed to flee quickly enough were massacred. A Japanese report, discovered in the Tokyo archives in 1963 by American historian Bernard C. Nolte, coldly documented, infantry units under the command of Colonel Yoshitaka Shibuya carried out pacification operations at 62 locations across the Kushian Valley. Minimal opposition encountered. Approximately 8,400 hostiles neutralized. Agricultural resources destroyed as ordered. Hostiles was a Japanese term for any Chinese civilian in a zone of operations. The use of biological warfare amplified the horror. Unit 731, the Japanese biological weapons program commanded by 50-year-old General Shiro Ishii, had already conducted horrific experiments on Chinese prisoners for years. During Operation Seigo, Japanese aircraft deliberately spread infected fleas to bubonic plague over cities in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. The intention was multiple: to test the effectiveness of biological weapons in field conditions, to create terror among the civilian population, and to cause mass casualties without wasting ammunition. The consequences were catastrophic. Outbreaks of bubonic plague broke out in at least 7 cities between May and August 1942. Kuzhou, Yiwu, and other cities have reported hundreds of cases. Without modern antibiotics, the mortality rate was approximately 60 to 90%. Victims suffered extreme fevers, painful swollen lymph nodes, and agonizing death within days. Entire communities were decimated. Cruelly, plague outbreaks continued for years after the end of the initial campaign, as the bacteria Yersinia pestis became established in local rodent populations, causing recurring outbreaks. Estimates of deaths from bubonic plague deliberately introduced by the Japanese during and after Operation Seigo range from 10,000 to 30,000 people. In August 1942, when Operation Seigo officially ended, the devastation was immeasurable. Colonel Takeda compiled a final report for General Hatta that listed results with the bureaucratic precision characteristic of professional military personnel documenting atrocities. According to the report, 28 airfields destroyed or rendered unusable, 262 bridges demolished, 3,608 military or government buildings destroyed, approximately 1,600,000 square meters of plantations burned or poisoned. Then, almost as an afterthought, the report noted, estimated enemy casualties, 2,800 irregular combatants, 27,000 civilian supporters. The mathematics did not add up and was not intended. Civilian supporters was a euphemism for any Chinese civilian killed during the operation. When later researchers, including Chinese historian Liu Yanxi, compiled records of destroyed villages, compared census data from 1943 with 1943, and collected thousands of testimonies from survivors, the true civilian death toll emerged. Approximately 250,000 people had died as a direct or indirect result of Operation Seigo. Some were executed directly by Japanese soldiers. Others died when their homes were burned with them inside. Tens of thousands starved to death when their crops were destroyed. Thousands died from plague or other diseases. 250,000 Chinese civilians killed in retaliation for an American airstrike that had killed approximately 50 Japanese civilians. In Washington, D.C., Doolittle's raid was celebrated as a masterful propaganda triumph. Doolittle, who had returned to the United States via India and Africa after escaping from China with the help of nationalist guerrillas, was promoted to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel altogether, and received the Congressional Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony on May 19, 1942. President Roosevelt, in a speech to the American public, referred to the attack as proof that the American spirit cannot be broken, and our ability to carry war into the heart of the enemy is growing daily. Newspapers across the United States ran headlines celebrating the surprise attack on Tokyo and Colonel Doolittle's masterstroke. Domestic morale, which had been dangerously low since Pearl Harbor, rose dramatically. Military enlistment increased 23% in the 2 weeks following the announcement of the attack. The mission was presented as a perfect example of American courage, ingenuity, and the ability to improvise solutions to impossible problems. What was not widely reported because information was scarce and confusing was what was happening in China as a direct consequence. Some reports of Japanese atrocities in China began to appear in the American press in June and July of 1942, but were treated as propaganda or exaggeration. Western correspondents had very limited access to inner China, communications were difficult, and the American public was more focused on developments in Europe and the Pacific, where American forces were directly engaged. Furthermore, Japanese atrocities against Chinese civilians had been known since the Nanking Massacre, and yet another report of Japanese brutality did not seem particularly remarkable in the context of a world war already characterized by unprecedented levels of violence against civilians. General Claire Lee Chennault, 49 years old, commander of the American Air Forces in China and leader of the famous Flying Tigers, tried to alert commanders before Americans about the consequences of Operation Seigo. In a report dated July 18, 1942, sent to General Henry Arnold in Washington, Chennault wrote, Chinese intelligence sources report Japanese retaliation on a massive scale in the coastal provinces in response to the April attack. Entire villages being destroyed, civilian infrastructure systematically demolished, civilian casualties could be in the tens of thousands. Our future operations in this region must consider that the local population will pay a terrible price for any assistance we provide to American personnel. The report was archived and apparently never reached high-level decision-makers, or if it did, it was considered less important than more pressing operational priorities. The true scale of what had happened only gradually emerged in the years after the war. When Japanese forces surrendered in August 1945, military documents were captured by Allied forces, including detailed reports of Operation Seigo. Investigators at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, established in Tokyo in 1946 to try Japanese war criminals, uncovered extensive evidence of atrocities committed during the campaign. Chinese witnesses, many traveling for weeks from remote villages, provided devastating testimony. A woman, Zhao Liling, 38 years old in 1946, described how Japanese soldiers had burned down her village in June 1942, killing her husband, 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. She survived hiding in a well for 16 hours. "They burned everything," she testified through an interpreter. "Our house, our barn, our harvest. They killed our animals. They poisoned our well. My village had 236 people. When the Japanese left, 31 were still alive." Multiplied by hundreds of villages, the pattern was undeniable. General Hatta was convicted of war crimes, including his supervision of Operation Seigo, and sentenced to life in prison, serving until his death in 1962. Other officers directly involved, including Colonel Takeda, were also convicted. Doolittle lived until 1993, dying at the age of 96 as one of the most decorated and respected aviators in American history. He has never spoken publicly, in any depth, about the Chinese consequences of his attack. In his memoirs, published in 1988, he dedicated exactly 2 short paragraphs to Operation Seigo, acknowledging that Chinese suffered terribly in retaliation for helping us, but not elaborating on numbers or details. When asked directly by interviewers in his later years whether he felt guilt for Chinese civilian deaths, Doolittle typically responded that war decisions always involved tragic costs, that responsibility for atrocities rested entirely with Japanese military command, and that the attack had been necessary for American morale and to demonstrate Japanese vulnerability. These responses were defensive, but not incorrect. The moral dilemma had no simple solution. The Doolittle mission had indeed dramatically boosted American morale at a critical time, had forced Japan to maintain air defense fighters in the main territory that could have been used offensively in the Pacific, and had contributed to the Japanese decision to attempt to extend its defensive perimeter, leading to the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese Navy suffered a devastating defeat. These strategic results were real and meaningful. But it was also real that 250,000 Chinese civilians had died as a direct result. American military historian John Toland, in his monumental work, The Rising Sun, published in 1970, devoted an entire chapter to the aftermath of Doolittle's attack, entitled The Price of Revenge. Toland wrote, "The Doolittle raid was brilliant as a military operation and propaganda, but Americans celebrating in the streets of their safe cities never knew that each bomb dropped on Tokyo would cost approximately 1,500 Chinese lives. The mathematics of war is rarely simple, and the justice of inflicting harm on the enemy must always be weighed against the cost to those unable to defend themselves." This perspective, written 3 decades after the events, reflected growing historiographical discomfort with simplistic narratives of military heroism that ignored unintended but predictable consequences. Other historians have argued that American commanders should have anticipated Japanese retaliation against Chinese civilians, given the well-documented history of Japanese brutality since 1937. General Chennault had warned of exactly this possibility before the mission was approved, but his warnings were apparently ignored by planners in Washington focused on short-term strategic objectives. In modern China, Operation Seigo is remembered but not widely known outside the directly affected provinces. Memorials exist in several cities, including Kuzhou and Yushan, honoring civilians killed during the Japanese punitive campaign. The memorial in Kuzhou, dedicated in 1985, lists the names of approximately 3,200 identified victims from the local area, a small fragment of the total. An inscription on the memorial reads in Chinese and English, "They died not in battle but out of mercy. Their kindness to foreigners cost them everything. May the world remember both their compassion and the brutality of their killers." Annually on April 18th, increasingly elderly survivors and their descendants gather for ceremonies of remembrance. In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the Doolittle raid, a group of American veterans of the mission, only 5 still alive at that time, traveled to China to find Chinese survivors who had helped save them 50 years earlier. The meeting was deeply emotional. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Eugene Cole, 76, Doolittle's co-pilot, and at the time the last surviving member of the lead plane's crew, met with Wang Yongkang, 82, who in 1942 had been a young villager who guided American airmen over mountains to escape Japanese patrols. Through an interpreter, Wang described how Japanese people had arrived in his village 3 days after he helped the Americans and executed his father and 2 uncles, burning 43 houses, including his own. Cole, visibly shaken, said, "We had no idea. We knew there was retaliation, but not the scale. You and your family paid a terrible price for saving us." Wang replied, "Japanese were our enemy. You came to fight Japanese. We did what was right. But yes, the cost was very high." The Doolittle mission remains one of the most complex and morally ambiguous episodes of World War II. As an aviation feat, it was extraordinary. 16 crews carried out a mission considered almost suicidal, and only 3 men died in the combat and landing process, a surprising survival rate. As a propaganda operation, it was brilliantly successful, boosting American morale precisely when needed and demonstrating to the world that Japan was not invulnerable. As a strategic decision, it had measurable positive consequences, including influencing the Japanese Navy to seek premature expansion of its defensive perimeter, leading to the defeat at Midway. But as an action that triggered genocide against a defenseless civilian population, it creates profound ethical dilemmas. American commanders did not order massacres of Chinese civilians. American soldiers did not pull triggers or wield bayonets. But the causal chain is clear and direct. Without Doolittle's attack, there would be no Operation Sago, and 250,000 people would not have died. Arguing that responsibility lies exclusively with the Japanese military is technically correct, but morally unsatisfactory. Military planners have an obligation to consider reasonably foreseeable consequences of their actions, including enemy retaliation against civilians. The history of Japanese brutality against Chinese civilian populations was well documented in April 1942. The likelihood of severe retaliation against Chinese aiding American airmen was not merely possible, it was highly probable. 70 years after the events, when almost all of the direct participants were dead and historical documents had been extensively studied, academic consensus emerged. The Doolittle mission was simultaneously a tactical strategic success for the United States and a catastrophic humanitarian tragedy for Chinese civilians. These two realities are not mutually exclusive. They are different facets of the same military operation. Modern historians, including Rana Mitter of Oxford University in his work, China's War with Japan, published in 2013, argue that the story of World War II in the Asian theater has consistently been told from a Western perspective that downplays or completely ignores the experiences and sacrifices of Asian populations. The Doolittle attack is a perfect example, celebrated in American films, books, and memoirs as a heroic triumph, while the 250,000 Chinese victims remain largely unknown outside specialized academic circles and local Chinese communities. This asymmetry in historical memory, which reflects implicit hierarchies of value where Western lives are documented, remembered, and lamented, while Asian lives become abstract statistics or footnotes. Correcting this imbalance requires not diminishing the courage of American airmen or denying the strategic significance of their mission, but adding full context that includes all consequences, especially those paid by people who did not choose to participate in the war, but were destroyed by it. The final lesson from Operation Sago is not that the Doolittle mission was a mistake or that it should not have been conducted. Arguments can be made in both directions, depending on how one weighs costs versus benefits, short-term versus long-term values, American lives versus Chinese lives. The lesson is more fundamental. Military actions, especially those conducted with great propaganda fanfare, always have consequences that extend far beyond their intended targets. Bombing Tokyo was not just about damaging Japanese factories or shaking enemy military confidence. It was also, inevitably, about how the Japanese Empire would respond and who would pay the price for that response. American planners in Washington, focused on creating necessary psychological victory for their own country, underestimated or simply did not adequately consider the price that would be paid by allies on the ground, specifically the Chinese civilian population. This failure of moral imagination, or perhaps cold strategic realism that considered 250,000 Chinese lives as an acceptable cost for raising American morale, defines much about how wars are fought and who suffers their consequences. Japanese soldiers took up their weapons, lit their matches, and spread the plague. But American airmen dropped the bombs knowing, or should have known, that retaliation would come. And American commanders approved the mission by weighing benefits to the United States against costs to China, deciding that benefits justified costs, even if costs would be paid entirely by others. This is the brutal mathematics of total war strategy, where democratic nations committed to humanitarian values make choices that sacrifice allied civilian populations for their own military gains. There is no comfortable moral resolution, only recognition that victory in World War II, justifiably celebrated as the triumph of democracy over fascism, was built on mountains of corpses that included not just soldiers, but hundreds of thousands of civilians whose names will never be known and whose sacrifices are rarely remembered outside their own devastated communities.